One of the things they know, for example, is if you're having a problem and you call a therapist to make an appointment, you're finally going to do it because you tried everything else you can think of. You always do that before you go to the therapist, right? It's not the first option, it's always the last option. We know that when you call the therapist, that before you get to the therapist, you'll start to get better. Because hope has kicked in. Hope has kicked in that when I go to the therapist, it's going to get better. And so I've already started getting better. Some people will come and go, it just seems so much worse when I called you than now that I'm here. I feel kind of silly why I'm even here for this. It's like, stay. Okay, stay. But we've already started to do something, and that's part. It's hope that kicks in. And so forgiveness is a path to healing, it's a path to recovery, and it's a means of hope. Okay? That even when I'm not all better, I know I can get better, that things will improve. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, not so much what the process is, because that's a whole 3-week series too, and that's not what you came for. But I want to talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't, because I think it clarifies a lot and gets some of the things out of the way that prevent us from forgiving. Okay? I want us to think in a big model again. So again, let's step out of genocide alone as the only thing that needs to be forgiven, and think about maybe inside or someone that you know. Anybody who, first of all, consciously thinks I need to forgive that person, they hurt me, or that I just feel this desire to forgive, that's obvious. But anybody who feels like they're blocked or impeded or avoiding a relationship because there's been some hurt, probably needs forgiveness. Right? Anybody that's causing hurtful memories, so that when the hurtful memories come up, it just feels like it's happening all over again. I wish I'd stop thinking about this. I wish these memories or these dreams or these flashbacks would stop coming back. It needs forgiveness. Right? So this can be true for people who are survivors of war, whether it's in your family, whether you're a displaced person, whether you're in the military, whether you are a victim of violence, sexual abuse, batterers, incest, or even the family of a victim, because it has ramifications in the family. If you experience emotions as being debilitating, bitterness, anger, depression, hatred, if religion's getting in the way, whether it's church, clergy, God, right? All of those can generate hurt inside of us. Family of origin issues, abuse, addictions, mental illness, death, illness within the family, personal addictions, and what I've done and haven't done in terms of healing from my addictive behavior. People who are the victims of greed, including the poor, homeless, unemployed people. People who are victims of prejudice, according to race, nationality, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation. All of those things. Part of the hope with the process of forgiveness is it doesn't matter how old you are. There's none of this, I'm 40 now, it's too late for me. That's not true. Okay? Doesn't matter what the age was when the significant event happened. You can forgive later on. And it doesn't matter whether you have a current religious belief or practice or you don't, because the process that we teach is not a religious process, it's a psychological, educational process. Okay?
Tell us statistics.
Well, yeah. It's an interesting statistic. The research says that religious people, and it's self-identified, so you can identify it however you want. Religious people are more motivated than non-religious people to forgive. Religious people talk about forgiveness more than non-religious people talk about forgiveness. Religious people do not actually forgive any more than non-religious people. We want to, and we talk about it more, but we don't actually do it. And again, I come back to, I think part of it is because it's misunderstood and we don't know how. That's how I got into the whole topic in the first place. Someone came to me as the pastor and said, I want to forgive this person who hurt me when I was a child, how do I do it? And I didn't know. I had nothing to say to this person in terms of how do you do that? I had to go start asking questions and reading, get a degree. So let's just clarify some of the things. All right? Forgiveness is about a hurt that has occurred between people. Okay? So we're not talking about forgiving a tornado or a hurricane. Okay, we're talking about interpersonal forgiveness. As I'm going to define forgiveness, there's place for these other things, but I'm not talking about whether God forgives us. I'm not talking about whether we forgive ourselves. I'm talking about when we forgive someone who has hurt us. And that the injury is a deep, long-lasting injury. It's got a lot of consequences to it. So we're not just talking about someone bumped into me in the hall, or someone dropped a book on my foot. We're talking about something that really has had some serious consequences in my life. I know that it's affected me, even if I can't describe fully how it is. We're talking about that kind of an injury. Here's one of the first big important distinctions. Forgiveness is one-sided. Forgiveness is the process that I do inside myself about someone who has hurt me. And I'm going to use a different word. You can pick different words if you want to. I'm going to use a different word to make the distinction. Reconciliation is when we're trying to get the two people back together again, when we're trying to restore the relationship. So Sharon hurt me. I can forgive Sharon without ever seeing Sharon again in my life. I can forgive Sharon if Sharon is dead. I can forgive Sharon if she lives in California. Okay? I can forgive Sharon whether I'm never going to see her again and I haven't seen her for 40 years. Reconciliation is the process on top of forgiveness where we try to do something to restore the relationship. And that would have all kinds of gradations, whether it's merely tolerating her being in the room and skirting around her the whole time so I don't talk to her, or actually somehow extending the relationship in such a way that we could be friends again. And that's a whole lot of range, isn't it? Right?
This was a piece that we helped open and balled up about, because he had a notion that if you weren't available for reconciliation, he called it a false forgiveness. And we tried to explain that you can forgive without reconciliation. Reconciliation might not even be a good idea. It might be unsafe, because that requires the other person to be available for right relationship. And they may not be. Does that mean you never can forgive? And I think that was helpful. It broadened his notion.
It was their experience that they were doing a lot of work in reconciliation, because you could have people living in the same village that were perpetrators and survivors, and so reconciliation was an important dynamic if you could get there. But to simply stop and say, well, we can't do the reconciliation, therefore we can't do the forgiveness, was a really hindering thing, and a lot can be accomplished when I do the forgiveness, whether I can reconcile with the other person or not. That was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of, because we were coming out of our experience of working with survivors of childhood abuse and saying, it might not be safe for you to go back and see the perpetrator. You might need to keep your distance, or you're just going to get hurt all over again. Whereas he was thinking about people who are living together and how are they going to live together if they're not talking to one another or avoiding each other. So we were coming out of two different experiences that were kind of an extreme too.
Yeah, we were in the room with people who, here's one person sitting next to another person, and the parent of this person has killed the parent of that person. And they're in a room together in a training. And that's what they live with. This is a small country.
And small villages,
Small
if people are coming back to their homes. When we were working with the clergy, on the day before we were going to do the presentation on forgiveness, the bishop asked to meet with us privately first, and he asked us specifically not to reference the genocide when we did this talk. Now, it's like it's always in the room, so it's not like we had to, but he just said, I would ask you not to. And he said, why? And he said, because in this room you have priests whose family members were killed in the genocide. You also have priests in this room whose family members were part of the genocide and the perpetrators. Okay? They're all sitting right here in the same room.
How do you take into account, how do you discuss power dynamics? That is, does it make a difference if one who has been offended is in a position now so that they cannot be harmed by the previous offender, or in fact, maybe they have more power now than that offender? Isn't it a little easier, perhaps, to forgive if you know you're safe because of your power the power of some of your,
It would be one of the variables that affects the process. So we can talk at the same time that everybody kind of follows the same process, and yet it can also look different because of the variables that are involved. So if I'm just gonna use these 4 ladies in the front row, and if one was hurt when she was a little girl, one was hurt when she was adult, one was hurt by her spouse, and one was hurt by essentially a stranger, they still need to follow the same process, and yet it's also going to look very different because of the variables of age and who did it, what's the nature of the relationship with the person who hurt you. So those things would feed into it. So my sense of safety and boundaries relative to the offender would make a difference, but it's still the same process.
It strikes me that one of the most important things that you have to achieve first is the motivation among, let's say, the Hutus on a large scale, because you've got to start with motivation. And how did you possibly start with those people after what had happened there?
That's absolutely true, and I'm going to talk about it in 2 ways. One is I would tend to suggest that it is personal rather than group. So instead of me saying I have to motivate all the Hutus to do this, it's every individual has to make the decision whether they're going to do this or not, right? And I'll tell you a story about motivating people of whether or not they're going to forgive, right? I'm a mental health professional. I worked at a psychiatric hospital in Texas. And when the program found out that I had this background in forgiveness, they said, oh good, we're going to put that into the program. Thursdays at 3 o'clock was the forgiveness group. It's indelibly printed in my head. Okay? This was a locked ward of trauma survivors, so pretty seriously ill, right? And they get their schedule and they have to go to group. This isn't like option, all right? At Thursday at 3 o'clock, they're all in the forgiveness group. Okay? So, and they don't know I'm a clergyman, so at least we don't have that religious overlay, okay? They just know that the guy who's leading the group is doing forgiveness group today. I'm sitting down with, at that day, probably like 20, 25 childhood abuse survivors and saying, we're going to talk about forgiveness today. How do you suppose that went? It was my first experience of a tsunami. A wave, an emotional wave. It was 50 minutes of anger, saying, who are you? Why is the hospital telling us we have to do this? There's no way in God's green earth that and I'm cleaning it up, gonna do this, right? It was the whole period.
an hour of timeout.
An hour, yeah. Yeah.
Do your
And so I
thing.
said, well, you know, it's good. They were all feeling their feelings. They were expressing their feelings. I didn't get hurt, so that was good. So the next week, it's good. We got that all cleaned out of the way, so next week we can kind of pick up. Well, we didn't pick up at all. No, we had a rerun.